Well, let's get to our panel from London, Antonio Sampaio. He is a research associate at the International Institute for Strategic Studies and an expert on Latin American violence. From Sao Paulo, Denis Frate is the director of the Brazilian Association of Security Professionals. Arturo Sarukhan is a former Mexican ambassador to the United States. He is right here in our studio. And from Chicago, Dr. Gary Slutkin is the founder and CEO of Cure Violence. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Antonio, let me start with you in London. We just heard some of the reasons there on why there are such high levels of violence in Latin America. Things like unemployment, urbanization, the availability of guns. But these conditions exist in other parts of the world as well. If we look at the figures for Latin America, of the 20 countries in the world with the highest rates of murder, 17 are in Latin America. 43 of the top 50 cities are in Latin America. Why Latin America? What's driving these levels of violence so high?
Well, I would highlight two factors. One is that Latin America is the most urbanized of all developing regions. So both the US and Europe have around 80% of their populations living in cities, and Latin America is at the same level, around 80%. Africa and Asia are still urbanizing. They have around 50% of their people living in cities, and the rest lives in small towns or rural areas. And cities tend to congregate these risk factors that lead to violence and criminality, especially the illicit economies. And that's the second element, organized crime and the illicit transnational criminal economies that drive them. The report cites Mexico, Venezuela, and Brazil as being the most violent countries in Latin America. And these three countries, they tend to concentrate drug trafficking routes. Mexico to the United States, and in the case of Brazil and Venezuela, they have several routes that lead the drugs to Africa and then Europe. So it's a global problem, but it funnels itself through Latin America. So those two reasons, urbanization, rapid and unmanaged urbanization, and organized crime have been quite prominent in Latin America.
Dennis, let's look at it from another point of view. Let's look at it from the point of view of law enforcement, of the maintenance of law and order in these countries. How big an issue is that?
Well, this is it's a very big difficult to explain. I wouldn't say that it's a very easy way to explain this, but there are very variables that you can put on that. Law enforcement is just one point. But I would say that organized crime is plays a very important role in this particular area. Organized crime has been raised for the last years a lot, and the gangs are getting more and more sophisticated and professionals. And that's added with the problem with the social gap that we have in our countries. With a high volume of people. That explains why this organized crime has made so significant increase. Also, I would say that the social gap is also a very important point with a very concentrated people in the cities. That's one of the most important points that we can point out.
Ambassador, we heard about those four countries. Mexico is among those four countries. Mexico, Brazil, Venezuela, Colombia, all account for a quarter of all murders in the world. Are there very different reasons why we get these levels of violence in these different countries?
Well, certainly you can't approach them with the same measuring stick. Mexico, in part, has some of these challenges because it is precisely on the route to the United States, still a very significant consumer market for a lot of illicit drugs. Different patterns in the case of Brazil and Venezuela, as Antonio has just suggested, but there's one common chord, which is that whether it's urbanization, whether it's the polarization and social inequality, the weakness of the rule of law throughout the Americas, or Latin America and the Caribbean, is a common thread. It is the Achilles heel of most of these countries. Also, the report mentions Venezuela, Brazil, Mexico, but we have to remember that we're seeing very significant spikes continued violence in Central America, El Salvador, Honduras, which are accounting for some of these transmigration patterns that we're seeing through Mexico on their way to the United States. Very, very significant dynamics at play there that are also having an impact on this. And in fact, in many ways, we could argue that what we're seeing in in Honduras and El Salvador today is to a certain degree that they've become victims to the US and Mexico's success in by confronting some of the cocaine trafficking routes from South America through Mexico on the way to the United States. We're basically sort of playing whack-a-mole. You hit it on the head here and it's going to pop up here. We have triggered some of these challenges in the Central American Isthmus as organized crime looks for new routes and new transshipment mechanisms to bring these drugs into the U.S., particularly the U.S. market.
Gary, you are an epidemiologist, and your organization, the NGO Cure Violence, you have a very different approach to the issue of violence. You see it as a medical issue, like a contagious disease, I guess. Explain that to us.
So we see violence as an epidemic process like other health epidemics. That is to say, it spreads, it causes more of itself, and it meets the definition of disease and of contagious, the medical definitions, the regular definitions. And so what historically what we're seeing in the region is the violence emerging, the homicides and the gang cartel and all the things that are going by these names really emerged in Central America following the civil wars. And we've seen this in other places too, including even South Africa. After the Civil War, homicide rates increased. In many of these Central American countries, they doubled. In Honduras, they quadrupled after the war. I realized that not every country, including Brazil and Mexico, did have civil wars, but they didn't have to, because the violence spreads into places next to it from people who have either migrated or just from dissemination of the idea, or that is to say, exposure. We also treat it differently. We work it like as we work other epidemics from the inside out, training people who have access and trust to cool down violence. And we're seeing in places like El Salvador and Honduras and Mexico and also Trinidad very strong reductions in killings. I mean, we're seeing an 88% drop in shootings and killings in some communities in San Pedro Sula. There was an independent evaluation of Trinidad showing a 60% drop, 30 to 50% in a couple Mexican communities in Juarez. And so it responds to epidemic management with interrupters and outreach workers, as well as has been shown in some other cities and in a couple places in Africa.
Okay. Ambassador, that is a unique approach. What do you make of it?
Well, I think that understanding this as a holistic phenomenon is incredibly important because of how the Americas are connected, whether it's because of the illicit patterns of drugs going in one direction and bulk cash and guns from the United States going in the other direction. Right. The organized crime syndicates throughout the region are able to corrupt and to kill and to buy sophisticated weaponry because of that bulk cash coming across the border into Mexico and other parts of Latin America. So I think treating it holistically as a single phenomena is very, very important. Now, there are, again, differences between different nations and different approaches. The one thing that I think also is something that we have to understand and look at carefully is how social cohesion and the social contract play into this. In places like, for example, when Mexico decided to confront organized crime starting in 2007, you saw two very dramatic and very different stories in Ciudad Juarez, which has been mentioned by Gary, and Tijuana. They were experiencing very high levels of violence, but then suddenly one of those two cities started seeing a very steep drop in violence and killings. And the reason, compared to the other city, which was Ciudad Juarez, is that the local businessmen, society, NGOs worked with the federal, state, and local governments and didn't decamp across the border to the United States like what you saw happening in Ciudad Juarez. There was a vacuum in Ciudad Juarez. Social cohesion was broken, and that's what organized crime took advantage of to deepen its grip on the city. So understanding it holistically and understanding the role that the social contract and/or social cohesion play in some of these communities is also a very important tool.
Antonio, looking at this holistically, as the ambassador points out, how much of a commitment is there on the part of these governments in these countries where there are high levels of violence to combating this issue? Do we see it as a priority for these countries?
Well, it's certainly at the top of the list of political issues in many of these countries. I would even say most of these countries. If you look at the electoral campaigns, this year is full of elections in Latin America. Public security violence is on the top of the list. And obviously, you see a few countries in which the approach to persecute, to adopt an iron fist and adopt a very militaristic approach to combating crime is still very present, especially in Central America, the cases of El Salvador, Honduras. However, there is also the problem of resources. So you saw a steep reduction in criminal violence in, for instance, Rio de Janeiro between 2008 and more or less 2013, during the period in which a program called the Pacification Program was implemented that consisted of permanent presence of sometimes armed forces, but sometimes police in the slums, and followed by socio-economic development measures, infrastructure, etc. What we've seen recently is that these approaches that have showed great promise and significant success during some times, that combine holistically policing, security measures with socioeconomic, more sociological programs, if you will. They are very expensive, and they require a lot of efforts, a lot of resources. And Brazil, for instance, faced a huge economic crisis in the recent years.
Right.
So sometimes you see a lot of political rhetoric not being followed up by efficiency, and sometimes you see good intentions not being followed up by resources. So Latin America is a very poor region, so that factors in as well.
Right. Dennis, what do you make of that approach? As Antonio was telling us, a permanent police presence on the streets of, let's say, the cities of Brazil. I mean, a show of force on the cities. The federal government in Brazil has done that. Does it help?
Yes, they have done this, but also we should raise to our discussion one recent thing that happened here, what we call the car wash situation, the car wash investigation that has been undertaken by federal judge here in Brazil. And car wash has unveiled a lot of endemic corruption. And everybody saw here after this, when this process going on, that a lot of corruption from the government was installed, mainly in Rio de Janeiro, where the governor now, ex-governor, is he has more than 100 years of a sentence of prison. That probably can explain why this program of Rio de Janeiro has not worked as it was. I mean, a lot of resources have been diverted from the original point for the corruption, for the endemic corruption in the government. But on the streets, I think depending on the city of Brazil, Brazil is very different. It's a big country with different cultures, and you can have many countries inside Brazil. In some areas, you can realize the police acting okay, and some areas they are completely, left over. I mean, this is a very big problem for the average citizen. It doesn't have the sensation of security, which is a very important thing, having a sensation of security.
Gary, getting back to the approach that Cure Violence has adopted, as you pointed out, you've had some success in certain areas, but I'm wondering how would that kind of approach work in a place like Mexico, which, as the ambassador pointed out, where you have the drug trade, bulk cash going in one direction, drugs going in the other direction, much of that being enforced through violence. How would your approach work in a country like that?
It isn't only just how it would, it's how it actually is working. So I want to take Honduras, but we could talk about Mexico as well, or El Salvador. I mean, or Trinidad. There are like established successes, some of them independently evaluated, others with very good data. I mean, Honduras, in San Pedro Sula, there are rates of violence that were 10 times Chicago, not twice, 10 times. And the approach, although it took a little while to set it up and find the right community groups to organize it, this was the way of finding people who have access and credibility and trust with the different groups. They're called gangs or whatever they're called, who have access and trust, who are able to stop a dispute from progressing to being a shooting. In Honduras, one of the leaders of one of the more famous groups, as it were, actually made a statement that I didn't know how I'd ever get out of this violence. I didn't think my kid would ever even have a way out of it, but this is the way out of it. Now, you know what's happened to their selling of drugs when there's a demand for drugs? It probably has gone down some. It may have stayed the same, but the violence is like way, way down. In fact, one of those communities went a year without any shootings or killings at all, which was unheard of in anybody's memory. So, you know, we overplay these words like cartel and gang and all kinds of criminal this and criminal, and then we have these scary words, and then we say, oh, then we need the police. A lot of times the police are actually adding to, because they're in the violence themselves. People look at them as the saviors of the violence, when in many cases they're adding to it, or they're within so think of an epidemic of flu or cholera. You know, a lot of the workers are right in the epidemic themselves. So what's required is to really cool down the situation. I mean, there's, in a lot of the world, a lot of the country, you know, people are selling drugs, even though they're illegal, because somebody wants the drugs. But actually, the drug behavior and the violent behavior aren't exactly the same. It's just like smoking and drinking. You know, someone can stop smoking while they're still drinking. And so we've coalesced these things too much.
Yeah, Ambassador, I mean, we've been hearing about all these solutions. If we look at, as Gary just pointed out, political commitment, we've heard some very radical solutions being proposed to combat the violence. We heard in our report there, the Mexican presidential hopeful, Jaime Rodriguez, he says he wants to chop off the hands of thieves. The far-right candidate in Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro, wants to relax gun laws. He says, well, we should get more guns out there. That's going to stop the violence. Much of an argument you hear in the United States as well. But Antonio told us that it's got to be a twin-track approach here. You know, you can tackle this problem of violence. It's got to go side by side with some kind of social program to make sure that these conditions are taken away as well.
Absolutely. Look, I don't think you solve gun violence with more guns on the streets. I think it's a ridiculous approach. And I think that what we heard from this independent Mexican candidate is buffoonery. But having said that, it is clear that we need a much more enlightened approach to how we confront this. I also agree that how we create a narrative of what is at stake is critically important. I think that the paradigm with which the US has taken on the issue of illicit drugs for the past 30 years is completely broken. A paradigm which, by the way, most countries at the UN in Latin America have adopted as their own. I think it's a failed approach. And increasingly, there will be tensions between the domestic posture that the US has today, whether it's a de facto, not a de jure position, as 9 states in the United States have legalized recreational cannabis. It's going to be much harder for the United States internationally to ask countries like Mexico, for example, to continue investing its Churchillian quota of blood, sweat, toil, and tears to eradicate or interdict cannabis on its way to the United States market, because people are going to start saying, you know, you can't have your cake and eat it too. So there's a recasting of how we talk about this. This whole notion of the war against drugs is a failed paradigm. Believing that if you can impact supply, then you will change demand patterns is completely wrong. It's completely misguided. So it's not only about how you set in motion complementary policies, but how you recast the conversation.
Dennis, something that we've not talked about in this discussion on violence, and that is, we see all this violence on the streets of Latin American cities, but there's also an explosion of violence in prisons in many countries, in many cities in Latin America, driven by prison gangs. How does that contribute to overall violence? Because in many instances, it's a revolving door, isn't it? People go into prison, they join gangs, they come out, the violence continues. Have authorities got a handle on this, or have they lost control?
Yes. This is a very important point you raised, because let's take one example why organized crime got so strong here in Brazil. One of the most prominent, let's say so, gangs is a party, is a political, they're not political party, but it's a crime gang. It's called the PCC. It started because the prison, the inmates, they wanted to call attention for better conditions in the prisons. And that was the starting point of a criminal organization. Actually, it started in a soccer, in a football team inside a prison. And those guys, they wanted to call attention for the problems that they had in prisons. And that they got together and they started getting stronger and stronger. And now it was created a very big organized entity, let's say so. Yeah. And this is because of the very bad conditions in the prisons. Recently, we had, in the beginning of 2017, a lot of riots in the north of Brazil with rivals, the gang rivals, where they killed a lot of people. And that exposes very much the jail situation in Brazil. Right. Brazilian jails are in a very, very bad situation. They are overcrowded. They have no human conditions. And that's a fuel for, very, very bad riots and to strong the criminal outside the prisons. Right. And also, the control of these prisons is very, very weak, very, very bad. Everybody can have cell phones very easily. They can command from inside the prisons all the actions that they make in the streets.
Okay, Antonio, I've just got about a minute left, and I want to go very quickly to something else, and that is we see these high levels of violence in countries like Mexico, Brazil, Honduras, Guatemala, but there are also countries in Latin America where we don't see these high levels of violence, countries like Costa Rica, Chile, Argentina, Uruguay. How does one explain that? Why is there no violence in some countries and such high levels in neighboring countries?
Well, that's when I want to go back to something that Gary said about organized crime, that sometimes it's overplayed. I think that it's important to talk about organized crime and to tackle organized crime and explore how it influences violence, because precisely so that we can treat some communities in which the problem is still at its embryonic phase, and it's more a problem that can be tackled through public health issues, tackling addiction, or youth violence before they join these big organized criminal groups. And then there is another element of the problem, which is the highly transnational organized criminal groups, such as the First Capital Command, the PCC, based in São Paulo in Brazil, that Denis mentioned. And we have to tackle these problems with different tools. And we have to have sophisticated public policy tools to tackle these problems. Otherwise, we'll tackle them with the same tools and have very bad results. Okay. And this presence of organized criminal groups explains why in Costa Rica, in Peru, these organizations are not as evolved as they are in Brazil and Mexico, and therefore violence tends to be a bit lower.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.